Tonight, we will tell you a story not of kings or battles, but of quiet heroism. A story of how ordinary medieval villagers, without modern technology or global supply chains, faced the most formidable enemy each year, winter. You will learn why the autumn harvest was a frantic race against time, and how every last kernel of grain and root vegetable was painstakingly gathered. You will discover the ingenious yet simple methods they used to preserve food for months without refrigeration, from smoking meats to drying fruits. We will explore how their humble, mud-walled homes became fortresses against the biting cold, and how every scrap of wool and leather was vital for warmth. You will understand the critical role of their livestock, often sharing the warmth of their homes, and the constant back-breaking labor of gathering enough fuel to survive. This is also a story of community, of how shared burdens and mutual aid were not just ideals, but the very foundation of their existence. You will see the constant struggle against illness in the long, dark months, and the limited, often herbal remedies available to them. And finally, you will feel the sheer endurance required to simply make it through, clinging to small comforts and the unwavering hope for the eventual return of spring. This is not just a historical account. It is a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the profound wisdom of living in harmony with the natural world, even when that world was unforgiving. It is about a strength that shaped not just their individual lives, but the very fabric of human history. Oh, and if you enjoy these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment with topics you'd like to hear next. New sleep stories are released here every day. All right, find a comfortable spot, let your breath slow, and allow yourself to drift back to a time when survival was an annual art form. We will begin not in a grand hall, but in the humble, mud-walled homes of a medieval village, as the first chill of autumn begins to bite the air. Tonight, I will tell you a story not of heroes or ancient gods, but of ordinary people, men and women who faced a challenge far older and more relentless than any mythical beast. It is a story of survival, of quiet courage, and of the profound resilience of the human spirit. You will journey back to a time many centuries ago, to the heart of the European Middle Ages, a world without electricity, without modern medicine, without the vast supply chains we now take for granted. You will discover how entire villages, isolated and vulnerable, prepared for and endured the long, unforgiving grip of winter, relying only on their wits, their hands, and their community. This is a tale about the rhythm of life in a simpler yet infinitely harder time, a time when the turning of the seasons held the power of life and death itself. So, settle in and let us begin our journey into the quiet struggle of the past. The world of the medieval villager, often called a peasant, was defined by the relentless cycle of the seasons. Life was a constant, arduous dance with nature, a struggle to coax enough sustenance from the land to simply exist. There were no supermarkets, no imported goods, no easy transportation to bring supplies from distant places. A village, typically a small cluster of timber and thatch houses surrounded by fields, was an island in a vast, often untamed landscape. Its inhabitants lived in intimate, immediate connection with the earth, their fortunes inextricably linked to the unpredictable whims of weather and harvest. For most, life was short and physically demanding, marked by ceaseless labor from dawn until dusk. Every day was a testament to endurance, every meal a small victory. But of all the challenges they faced, none loomed larger or with more existential dread than the coming of winter. As the vibrant greens of summer faded into the muted browns and grays of autumn, a palpable sense of urgency settled over the land. Winter was not merely a season of cold. It was a period of profound scarcity, a time when the land itself seemed to hold its breath, offering nothing new. The very ground froze hard, making cultivation impossible. Rivers and streams could turn to ice, cutting off travel. Snow could blanket the landscape for weeks, even months, transforming familiar paths into impassable drifts. For the medieval villager, winter was a period of isolation, a time when their small world shrank to the boundaries of their immediate settlement, and often to the very walls of their humble homes. The threat was multifaceted and absolute. Food, the most fundamental requirement for survival, was the primary concern. What was not harvested and carefully stored during the fleeting warmth of autumn would simply not exist during the long, dark months ahead. There was no resupply from outside. If the harvest had been poor, if disease had struck the livestock, or if unexpected rains had ruined the drying grains, the consequences were dire and immediate. Starvation was a real, ever-present specter, claiming the weak and the old first, but capable of sweeping through entire families if the food ran out completely. The cold itself was also a killer. Without adequate shelter and warmth, the biting wind and pervasive dampness could lead to hypothermia, frostbite, and a host of respiratory illnesses that, in an age without antibiotics or even basic medical understanding, often proved fatal. Beyond food and warmth, other dangers multiplied. Wild animals, driven by hunger, would venture closer to human settlements, posing a threat to both livestock and people. Travel became incredibly perilous, if not impossible, meaning that if a crisis struck, there was little hope of aid from neighboring villages or distant towns. Each village was, by necessity, a self-contained unit of survival. Their continued existence depended entirely on what they had managed to gather, produce, and preserve from their own fields, their own forests, and their own animals. This dependence on local resources meant that the success or failure of the preceding agricultural year was not just a matter of prosperity, it was a matter of life or death. A bountiful summer brought a measure of relief and hope, while a meager one cast a long, chilling shadow over the approaching winter. The air, as autumn deepened, was thick with the silent calculation of provisions, the anxious assessment of dwindling stores, and the quiet prayer that what they had would be just enough. The approach of winter was not just a change in weather, it was a countdown to a test of ultimate endurance, a time when every resource, every ounce of strength, and every bond within the community would be put to the harshest possible trial. The moment the vibrant greens of summer began to fade into the muted ochres and russets of autumn, a palpable shift occurred within the medieval village. The carefree laughter of children playing in the fields lessened, replaced by a quiet, determined urgency that settled over every household. Everyone understood that the coming weeks were not merely a time for gathering, they were a desperate, all-consuming race against the encroaching cold. The very breath of life for the next half year depended entirely on what could be harvested and secured before the ground froze solid and the first heavy snows descended. There were no distant supply lines, no merchants bearing exotic goods from warmer lands to replenish dwindling stores. Survival was a local affair, a testament to hard work, foresight, and the bounty of their own small patch of earth. The autumn harvest was, without question, the most critical period of the year. It dictated the very rhythm of life and survival for the entire community. From the earliest glimmer of dawn, often before the sun had even touched the highest peaks, until the last sliver of twilight vanished beyond the horizon, every able-bodied person, from the youngest child capable of pulling a weed or carrying a small bundle of kindling, to the eldest villager still strong enough to wield a sickle or sort harvested roots, poured their energy into the fields and forests. The air became thick with the sounds of communal labor, the rhythmic swish of scythes cutting through tall stalks of grain, the quiet rustle of gathered leaves, the distant thud of an axe felling timber for winter fuel, and the low murmur of voices, too tired for loud chatter, yet united in purpose. This was not merely work. It was a communal ritual of survival, an ancient dance performed year after year, driven by an instinct as old as humanity itself, the instinct to endure. The pervasive smell of damp earth, ripening crops, and human exertion hung heavy in the air, a scent that was both exhausting and, paradoxically, deeply reassuring. The primary focus was, of course, the grain. Fields of golden wheat, sturdy rye, nourishing barley, and humble oats stretched across the landscape, waiting patiently to yield their precious kernels. These grains were the indispensable backbone of the medieval diet, offering the most calories and the longest shelf life when properly stored. They were destined to be ground into flour for the daily bread, which formed the substantial bulk of every meal, brewed into ale, a safer and more nutritious drink than often tainted water, or cooked into hearty pottage, a thick, warming stew that could stretch meager provisions. Villagers moved in unison, often in long lines, their backs bent almost double, their hands calloused and raw from the relentless cutting and binding of sheaves. Each bundle, once cut, was meticulously stacked into conical formations known as stooks, standing upright in the fields. This allowed the remaining sun and wind to further dry the kernels, protecting them from destructive mold and rot, before they were painstakingly transported by simple wooden carts or carried on strong shoulders to the central threshing floor. The goal was to gather every single head of grain, for even a handful of lost kernels could mean the difference between bare sustenance and gnawing hunger in the bitter depths of winter. No stalk was left behind if it could be helped, as every grain represented a stored calorie. Beyond the grains, the earth offered its more immediate treasures. Root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, and turnips were carefully pulled from the cool, damp earth, their earthy scent distinct amidst the general smells of the harvest. These hardy vegetables, along with sturdy cabbages, were vital sources of vitamins and could be stored for many months if handled correctly. They were often buried in root cellars, simple underground pits lined with straw or sand, or sometimes in purpose-built stone cellars beneath homes or communal buildings, where the constant cool, dark temperature and moderate humidity would keep them from spoiling through the cold season. The forests and wild areas surrounding the village also became crucial foraging grounds, demanding just as much tireless effort. Children, under the watchful eyes of adults, would spend countless hours scouring the woods for wild apples that had fallen from old trees, late ripening berries clinging to thorny bushes, and most importantly, nuts. Hazelnuts, walnuts, and especially acorns, though requiring significant effort to gather in quantity and process to remove bitterness, provided essential fats and proteins that were otherwise scarce in the winter diet. Every single berry was meticulously picked, every fallen nut eagerly gathered, for nothing could be wasted. This was a time of absolute frugality, where every scrap of nature's generosity was eagerly accepted and accounted for. Legumes, such as peas and beans, were also diligently harvested. Once thoroughly dried, they offered a compact, high-protein food source that could be stored for extended periods without fear of spoilage. The pods were carefully shelled by hand, often around evening fires, and the small, hard peas and beans were then laid out on cloths in airy, sheltered spaces, such as attics or granaries, away from dampness, molds, and the ever-present threat of rodents or insects. The intensity of the harvest was amplified by the constant looming threat of the first killing frost. A single night of unexpectedly severe cold could decimate weeks of laborious effort, turning ripe crops into frozen, inedible mush and rendering a season's work futile. Villagers watched the sky with an almost religious fervor, studying the patterns of the clouds, feeling the subtle shifts in the wind, and listening intently for the warnings of local lore passed down through generations. If a sharp drop in temperature or a clear star-filled night, a classic sign of frost, was predicted, the work became even more frantic, a desperate, breathless rush to bring in every last bit before it was too late. The air was often filled with a nervous energy, a quiet tension that underscored the precariousness of their existence, a constant reminder that nature held the ultimate power. The race against the calendar was relentless. The collective effort was truly remarkable and deeply ingrained in their way of life. There was no room for individual ambition or isolated labor when the survival of the entire community was at stake. Neighbors helped neighbors, families pooled their meager resources, and the strong supported the weak, sharing tools, sharing burdens, and sharing the sheer physical exhaustion. The harvested bounty was not just for one family's larder. It was, in many ways, a shared resource that would sustain the entire village through the long, dark, silent months ahead. The fields, once bustling with ceaseless activity and the sounds of life, would eventually fall silent, leaving behind only the stubble of harvested crops, a stark and often poignant reminder of the immense labor that had just concluded. But the work was far from over. With the food gathered, the next monumental task, equally vital, was to ensure it could last, to preserve every precious calorie for the coming scarcity, transforming perishable bounty into enduring sustenance. With the bounty gathered from the fields and forests, the true battle for winter survival then began, the intricate and demanding art of preservation. This was not merely about storing food. It was a complex dance with time, a relentless race against decay, transforming highly perishable goods into sustenance that could last for months, sometimes even until the distant promise of the next spring. Every household, every family became a small, diligent factory of preservation, understanding that their very lives, the warmth in their bellies, and the energy for their daily labors depended utterly on these painstaking efforts. There was no room for error, no external supplies to fall back on if a batch spoiled or a storage method failed. The air in every village, in those crisp autumn weeks, was thick with the smells of drying, salting, and smoking, a tangible manifestation of collective anxiety and industrious hope. The most fundamental of all preserved foods, the undisputed bedrock of the medieval diet, was grain: wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These were the staple cereals, providing the essential flour for bread, the basis for hearty porridges, and the thickening agent for nourishing stews. After the intense labor of the harvest, the grain had to be threshed, a laborious process of separating the valuable kernels from the stalks and husks, often done with flails on a hard, clean floor or threshing circle. But freshly threshed grain still held significant moisture, making it highly susceptible to mold, mildew, and the destructive depredations of weevils and other pests. So it had to be thoroughly and uniformly dried. In many parts of the village, this meant spreading the grain thinly on large cloths or woven mats in sunny open areas, such as courtyards or even on the roofs of homes, where the sun and wind could work their magic. Villagers would constantly rake and turn the grain throughout the day, ensuring every kernel received even exposure to the drying elements. On less sunny days, or in damper, more northern regions, small dedicated drying kilns became indispensable. These were simple but effective structures, often constructed from local stone or packed clay, featuring a low fire burning in a chamber beneath a perforated floor where the grain lay. The gentle, consistent heat would slowly, patiently draw out the moisture, leaving the kernels hard, brittle, and remarkably dry. Once properly dried, the grain was carefully sifted to remove any remaining debris and then stored in large wooden bins, sturdy chests, or tightly woven sacks. These containers were typically kept in cool, dry places like attics, loft spaces above living areas where residual heat from the hearth could keep dampness at bay, or purpose-built granaries. The dry, earthy, almost sweet smell of stored grain was the very scent of security, a tangible promise of warmth and fundamental sustenance through the long, lean months ahead. This meticulous drying process was the difference between a winter of steady, if monotonous, meals and a winter of desperate hunger. Meat, a far more precious and less frequent commodity than grain, was preserved primarily through the ancient and highly effective method of salting. When an animal was slaughtered, a significant event, often taking place in late autumn before winter's deepest chills set in and feed became scarce, every single part was meticulously utilized. The fresh meat, especially cuts of pork, beef, and occasionally venison or mutton, was heavily rubbed with coarse, raw salt. This was not a light seasoning. It was a thorough, deep penetration of salt into every fiber of the flesh, a process that required strong hands and careful attention to detail. The salt acted as a powerful desiccant, drawing out moisture from the meat and creating an environment utterly inhospitable to the bacteria and microbes that cause spoilage. Large cuts of meat were then packed tightly into robust wooden barrels or large earthenware crocks, layers of meat alternating with generous, almost excessive, layers of salt. Sometimes A strong brine, a concentrated solution of salt and water, was used to fully immerse the meat, ensuring complete coverage. The barrels or crocks were then sealed with tight-fitting lids and stored in the cool, dark, and often damp environment of a cellar. The curing process was slow, taking weeks or even months for the salt to fully penetrate and preserve the meat. But the result was a product that could last for many months, often a year or more. The taste of salted meat was, by modern standards, intensely savory and often required prolonged soaking in fresh water before cooking to reduce its salinity. Despite its strong taste, it provided vital protein and fat, a stark and often welcome contrast to the fresh meat of summer, yet infinitely preferable to the alternative of starvation. Smoking offered another powerful and complementary method of preservation, often used in conjunction with or after salting, particularly for fish and certain cuts of meat. Fish, harvested in abundance from rivers, lakes, and coastal waters before the deepest freezes, were meticulously cleaned, gutted, and then either lightly salted or brined before being carefully hung on racks or hooks within dedicated smokehouses. These were typically simple, often rustic, wooden or stone structures with small, slow-burning fires, often fueled by hardwoods like oak, beech, or applewood, which imparted a pleasant, deep flavor to the food. The low, consistent heat and the continuous flow of smoke not only dried the food further, but also deposited natural antimicrobial compounds found in the smoke itself, inhibiting bacterial growth and insect infestation. The process of smoking could take days, sometimes weeks, a patient vigil where the smoke tenderly transformed fresh, delicate fish into firm, flavorful provisions with a distinct, smoky aroma and a rich, dark, almost lacquered color. Hams, bacon, and various types of sausages were also frequently smoked, adding another layer of preservation and a unique, coveted taste to the winter larder. The air around a smokehouse in late autumn or early winter would carry the pungent, inviting scent of wood smoke and curing meat, an aroma deeply intertwined with the diligent and hopeful preparations for the lean months. Root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, turnips, beets, and the more robust varieties of potatoes once they were introduced, were invaluable for their natural hardiness and their remarkable ability to store well over long periods. Unlike delicate leafy greens or softer fruits, these roots could withstand colder temperatures without significant spoilage and maintain their structure and nutritional value for extended periods. After harvest, they were carefully cleaned of excess soil, but importantly, they were not washed, as introducing moisture could accelerate decay. They were then stored in root cellars, which were purpose-built underground chambers, or in simpler yet effective pits dug into the earth and carefully lined with straw, sand, or sometimes even layers of dry leaves. These subterranean spaces provided a naturally cool, dark, and slightly humid environment, conditions crucial for preventing the vegetables from freezing, drying out, or sprouting prematurely. Layered meticulously with sand, sawdust, or straw, the vegetables would remain dormant, their natural sugars slowly converting to starches, making them sweeter and often more palatable over time as winter progressed. The cool, damp air of the cellar, carrying the faint, sweet, and wholesome smell of earth and stored produce, was another vital part of the winter survival strategy, a true lifeline. These humble roots, often overlooked in times of summer plenty, became the absolute backbone of many winter meals, providing essential vitamins, minerals, and much-needed dietary fiber that were otherwise scarce in the largely grain and meat-based winter diet. Their presence, carefully stacked and stored in the dark depths of the cellar, was a quiet, profound reassurance against the gnawing hunger that often accompanied the deepest, most isolated months of winter. Beyond these primary large-scale methods, other ingenious and equally vital techniques contributed to the diverse, albeit limited, winter larder. Cabbage, a robust and widely cultivated crop, was frequently fermented into sauerkraut, a tangy, nutrient-dense food that could last for many months and provided a crucial source of vitamin C, helping to ward off the debilitating effects of scurvy. Fruits, though generally less common and harder to preserve than vegetables, could be dried, like apples, pears, and plums, or, if a family was fortunate enough to have access, preserved in precious honey. Cheese, made from surplus milk during the warmer, more abundant months, was carefully aged, its hard, firm texture allowing it to endure for extended periods, providing concentrated nutrients and a valuable source of fat and protein when fresh dairy was unavailable. Every scrap, every surplus, every bit of bounty from the fields, forests, and animals was seen as a potential lifesaver, and absolutely nothing was wasted. The careful, almost ritual, with the vital task of food preservation completed and the precious stores carefully laid away, the villagers' attention turned with a profound sense of urgency to their homes. These were not the sturdy stone structures of lords and wealthy merchants. A medieval peasant's home was a remarkably simple affair, designed for utility and built from the immediate resources of the land. Most often, it was a single-room dwelling, sometimes with a small lean-to for animals, constructed using a method known as wattle and daub. This involved weaving a lattice of thin branches and stakes, the wattle, and then plastering it thickly with a mixture of wet soil, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung, the daub. The roof, typically steeply pitched, was made of layers of thatch, dried reeds, straw, or heather, woven together to shed rain and provide a measure of insulation. As winter's icy breath drew nearer, these humble dwellings required significant preparation to offer any real protection against the relentless cold. The first priority was to inspect the wattle and daub walls. Over the warmer months, cracks would inevitably appear as the daub dried and settled, or as insects and rodents gnawed at the straw. Families would spend days, sometimes weeks, patching these fissures with fresh mud and straw, meticulously sealing every gap that could allow the bitter wind to penetrate. It was a messy, laborious task, but every sealed crack meant a fraction less of the piercing cold seeping into their already frigid living space. The goal was to create as airtight a shell as possible, to trap whatever precious warmth could be generated within. Next came the roof. Thatch, while an effective insulator when well maintained, could become thin or damaged by storms and heavy rain. Before the snows arrived, villagers would clamber onto their roofs, carefully adding new layers of straw or reeds, repairing any worn sections, and ensuring the overlapping bundles were tightly packed. A leaking roof in winter was not merely an inconvenience. It meant dampness, increased chill, and the potential for illness in an environment where even minor ailments could quickly turn fatal. The dry, rustling layers of the newly repaired thatch were a sound of quiet victory against the encroaching elements. The small openings that served as windows, typically just narrow slits in the walls, were also a focus of their efforts. Glass was a luxury virtually unknown to the common villager. Instead, these openings would be covered with wooden shutters, or perhaps, for those who could afford it, a piece of oiled parchment or stretched animal bladder, which allowed a dim, diffused light to filter in while blocking the worst of the wind. More commonly, they were simply covered with heavy pieces of woven cloth or animal hides, pulled tightly across the frame and secured to prevent drafts. Even the doorway, usually just a heavy wooden plank door, would be sealed with thick cloths or hides once inside, creating a final barrier against the outside world. The earthen floor, cold and unforgiving, might be covered with a fresh layer of rushes or straw, offering a minimal buffer between their feet and the frozen ground beneath. At the very heart of these homes, and indeed at the very heart of medieval winter survival, was the open hearth. This was not a fireplace with a chimney as we might imagine today. In many peasant homes, it was simply a designated area on the earthen floor, often slightly depressed or ringed with stones, where a fire was kept burning almost constantly. It was the sole source of warmth, the only light after dusk, and the primary means of cooking. The air within these homes was often thick with the acrid smell of wood smoke, as the smoke from the fire had no proper chimney to ascend. It would simply rise, filling the single room, before eventually escaping through a small smoke hole in the roof, or simply lingering, slowly dissipating through the thatched roof and any remaining cracks in the walls. This constant exposure to smoke was a harsh reality of medieval life, contributing to eye irritation and respiratory ailments. But it was a necessary discomfort for the warmth it provided. Around this flickering, smoke-filled hearth, the family would huddle. Children would gather close, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames, seeking respite from the pervading damp chill that seemed to seep into their very bones. It was here that meals were prepared. Simple, warming stews simmered slowly in iron cauldrons suspended over the flames, or flatbreads baked directly in the glowing embers. The fire's warmth determined the rhythm of their days and nights, dictating where they slept, where they ate, and where they spent their meager hours of leisure. It was more than just a fire. It was the beating heart of the home, a fragile bastion against the overwhelming might of winter, a symbol of their continuous struggle for survival. Without its constant glowing presence, life would simply cease. As the days grew shorter and the biting cold seeped deeper into the very bones of the land, one of the most immediate and personal defenses against winter was the clothing worn by the villagers. Without external supply lines or easy access to diverse materials, every stitch, every fiber was a testament to self-sufficiency and relentless labor. The goal was simple: to trap the precious body heat and create a barrier against the relentless chill, a barrier that had to last for months. The foundation of nearly all medieval winter clothing was wool. Sheep, hardy animals well suited to the landscape, were not only a source of meat and milk, but, crucially, of their thick, insulating fleece. The annual shearing, typically in late spring or early summer, was a significant event, yielding the raw material that would be transformed into warmth. Once shorn, the wool was a greasy, tangled mass filled with dirt and burrs. It had to be meticulously cleaned, a laborious process involving washing in streams or large vats, often with lye or stale urine to help cut through the natural lanolin. This was women's work, often done communally, with hands chapped raw by the cold water. After cleaning, the wool needed to be prepared for spinning. This involved carding, using spiked paddles to disentangle the fibers and align them into a soft, fluffy roll, or roving. For finer, smoother yarns, the wool might be combed instead. This preparation was vital. Well-prepared fibers spun more easily and produced a more even thread. Then came the spinning itself, the rhythmic, constant turning of a drop spindle or a spinning wheel, drawing out the rovings into continuous threads. This was a skill passed down through generations, often occupying every spare moment, from tending children to sitting by the hearth in the evenings. The hum of the spinning wheel was a constant backdrop to village life, a sound of industry and foresight. Once spun, the yarn was ready for weaving. Simple looms, often vertical warp-weighted looms or horizontal frame looms, were set up in homes. Weaving was another time-consuming and skilled craft, interlacing the warp, longitudinal threads, and weft, transverse threads, to create cloth. The resulting fabric, often coarse and scratchy, was incredibly durable and warm. Its natural lanolin content, even after washing, provided a degree of water resistance, shedding light rain or snow, a small but important advantage when working outdoors. While wool was king, linen, derived from the flax plant, also played a role. Though less insulating than wool, linen was smoother and more breathable, making it ideal for undergarments worn directly against the skin. These linen layers helped to absorb sweat, preventing it from chilling the body, and could be washed more easily than woolens. Over the linen, villagers wore multiple layers of wool. A basic outfit might consist of a long-sleeved wool tunic, perhaps knee-length or longer, serving as the main body layer. Over this, in colder weather, a shorter, heavier tunic or a thick wool cloak, often fastened with a simple pin or brooch, provided additional warmth and protection from wind and snow. Leggings or hose, also made of wool, were essential for keeping the lower body warm, often tied to a belt or tunic to prevent them from slipping down. Head coverings were crucial to prevent heat loss, ranging from simple coifs or hoods to more elaborate woolen caps. For outdoor work, thick mittens or simple gloves, often knitted or sewn from scraps of wool or leather, protected hands from frostbite. Footwear was typically simple leather shoes or boots, often padded with straw or wool scraps for insulation. The feeling of cold stone or frozen earth through thin soles was a constant reminder of winter's grip, making every effort to insulate one's feet a high priority. Beyond woven fabrics, leather and furs supplemented the woolens. Animal hides, from the livestock they raised or from hunted wild animals, were painstakingly processed. Tanning, a long and often malodorous process, transformed raw hides into durable leather. This leather was then used for sturdy outer garments like jerkins or tunics, for belts, and for the soles and uppers of shoes. Furs, particularly from animals like rabbit, fox, or even sheepskin with the wool left on, were prized for their exceptional warmth. These were often sewn into cloaks or used as linings for hats and hoods, adding a vital layer of insulation against the most brutal winds and snow. The soft, dense fur, often smelling faintly of the wild, was a luxury born of necessity. Each piece of clothing was a valuable possession, not easily replaced. There was no concept of fast fashion or seasonal trends. Garments were made to last for years, if not decades. This meant constant maintenance. Holes were patched, tears were mended, and worn areas were reinforced with whatever scraps of fabric were available. A woman's sewing kit, containing needles made of bone or iron, thread spun from flax or wool, and a thimble, was an indispensable tool. The careful darning of a sock, the precise patching of a torn sleeve, was not merely a chore, but an act of survival, ensuring that the warmth painstakingly created would endure through the long, unforgiving winter nights. This continuous repair kept the cold at bay, one stitch at a time. Just as crucial as what they wore, just as vital as the food they painstakingly gathered and preserved, was the life that stirred and breathed alongside them in the medieval village, their livestock. These animals were not merely possessions, they were the very cornerstone of survival, providing not only nourishment, but also warmth, labor, and a constant living presence in the long, dark months of winter. The very rhythm of a medieval villager's life was intertwined with the needs and cycles of their animals, and preparing them for winter was a task as demanding and critical as any harvest. Consider the diverse array of creatures that shared their world. There were the sturdy oxen, their immense strength indispensable for plowing the fields in spring and autumn, and for hauling heavy loads. There were the dairy cows, offering precious milk from which butter and cheese could be made, providing vital fats and proteins. Pigs, often allowed to forage in the forests during warmer months, represented a significant source of meat and fat, especially valuable for rendering into lard for cooking and preservation. Sheep provided not only meat, but also their invaluable wool, the very fiber that became the clothes on their backs. Goats, hardy and adaptable, gave milk and meat, thriving even on sparse forage. And then the chickens, scratching in the dirt, providing eggs, a daily protein source that was a small luxury in a time of scarcity. Each animal played a distinct, irreplaceable role in the intricate web of village life. As autumn deepened, the focus shifted from human food to animal sustenance. The fields, once buzzing with the human harvest, now yielded fodder for the beasts. Haymaking was an arduous, relentless task. Grass had to be cut, spread to dry in the sun, turned repeatedly to prevent mold, and then gathered and stacked into enormous compact ricks, often thatched to protect them from rain and snow. This was not just any grass. This was the stored breath of summer, the concentrated energy that would keep the animals alive through the scarcity. Beyond hay, villagers collected fallen leaves, dried them, and mixed them with straw, creating a bulkier, though less nutritious, feed. Grain husks, left over from threshing, were also carefully saved and mixed into the animals' winter diet. Every scrap of organic matter that could provide even minimal sustenance was meticulously gathered, for every mouthful of food an animal consumed was a mouthful that potentially saved a human life. Yet, despite all these efforts, the reality of winter meant that not all animals could be kept. Resources were finite. Thus, the grim but necessary autumn slaughter began. Families had to make agonizing decisions. Which animals were strong enough to survive the winter and breed in the spring, and which must be sacrificed now to provide meat for the coming months. This was not a quick, detached process. It was a deeply personal, often sorrowful act. The animals were part of their lives, known by name, their personalities familiar, but survival demanded it. The meat, once butchered, was then painstakingly preserved. Pork, beef, and mutton were heavily salted, packed into barrels, or hung in smokehouses, slowly curing over smoldering fires. The fat was rendered down, providing a calorie-dense cooking medium and a source of light when burned in simple lamps. The hides were carefully scraped, tanned, and dried, destined to become leather for shoes, belts, or protective coverings. Nothing was wasted. Every bone could be boiled for broth, every sinew for glue. With the food prepared, attention turned to shelter. Medieval homes, simple as they were often designed with the animals in mind. Many peasant dwellings were longhouses, where one end was dedicated to human habitation and the other to livestock. A sturdy partition, perhaps of wattle and daub, separated the spaces, but the shared roof and walls meant that the animal's body heat contributed significantly to warming the human living area. Imagine the chill of a winter night, the biting wind rattling the simple shutters. Inside, the air might still be cold, but the steady warmth radiating from a cow or an ox, perhaps just a few feet away through a thin wall, made a tangible difference. For smaller animals like chickens and pigs, simple coops or sties were built, sometimes even integrated into the main house structure, providing a more contained source of warmth. Preparing these animal shelters involved considerable labor. Barns and byres, often built from timber and wattle and daub, needed repairs. Roofs were rethatched to prevent leaks. Cracks in the walls were sealed with more mud and straw, and the ground was covered with fresh, thick layers of straw or rushes for bedding. This bedding served a dual purpose. It provided insulation and comfort for the animals, and as it became soiled with manure, it would decompose, generating a small amount of heat and, more importantly, becoming a rich, valuable fertilizer for the spring planting. The smell, a mix of damp straw, animal dung, and the earthy scent of their breath, would have been a constant presence, a reminder of the living, breathing heart of their survival. The daily routine during winter centered heavily on animal care. Each morning, breaking the ice on water troughs was a common chore, followed by carrying fresh water from the well or stream. The carefully rationed fodder was distributed. The animals would be checked for any signs of illness or injury. In close quarters, disease could spread rapidly, and a sick animal was a grave threat to the entire household's survival. Lacking advanced veterinary knowledge, villagers relied on traditional remedies, often herbal concoctions, and a keen eye for subtle changes in behavior. The death of an animal, particularly a cow or an ox, was a calamity, impacting not just the immediate food supply, but also the ability to work the fields in the coming season. Birthing during winter was a particularly precarious event. A newborn calf or lamb, fragile and vulnerable, needed constant attention and warmth. The mortality rate for young animals born in the cold was high, adding another layer of anxiety to the already stressful winter months. Villagers would often bring the youngest and weakest animals into the main living space, cuddling them by the hearth, their small, trembling bodies adding a tiny bit more warmth to the family circle. This shared space, this intimate coexistence fostered a unique bond between humans and their animals, a bond born of mutual dependence and the shared struggle against the relentless grip of winter. The lowing of a cow, the grunting of a pig, the clucking of chickens, these were the sounds of life, the constant affirmations that, despite the cold and the scarcity, they were not alone. The very breath of the animals, condensing in the cold air, was a visible sign of the heat they generated, a heat that flowed through the thin walls and into the human space, a silent, vital contribution to the family's ability to endure. This symbiotic relationship, this careful husbandry, was not just a practice, it was a deeply ingrained philosophy of survival. The need for warmth, however, extended far beyond the clothes on one's back. It touched the very heart of the home, demanding a constant supply of fuel. From the moment the first chill entered the autumn air, the gathering and management of firewood became an all-consuming task, second only to the harvest itself. It was a perpetual cycle, beginning in earnest as soon as the leaves began to turn, and only truly ending when the last snow melted in spring. For the medieval villager, wood was life. It provided the heat that kept families from freezing in their simple homes, the flame that cooked their meager meals, and the glowing embers that offered a small comforting light in the long dark nights. Access to forests was crucial. While some villages had communal woodland, others might have agreements with local lords for the right to gather fallen branches and dead wood. This was not a quick or easy process. Men, women, and even older children would spend countless hours, often in the biting cold, venturing into the dense woods. They would search for anything that could burn, fallen logs, broken branches, or even small sturdy bushes that could be cut down. Tools were simple but effective: axes, adzes, and sometimes crude hand saws. The sharp bite of the axe against wood, the rhythmic thud as logs were split, these were the sounds that echoed through the pre-winter landscape. Each stroke was an investment in survival. Once cut or gathered, the wood had to be transported back to the village. This was often done by hand, carried in bundles on backs, or dragged on rudimentary sledges if snow had already fallen. For heavier loads, if a village possessed an ox or a sturdy horse, simple carts would be employed, creaking under the weight of the timber. Every piece, no matter how small, was valuable. Twigs and smaller branches, often overlooked today, were painstakingly collected to serve as kindling, ensuring that a precious fire could be started with minimal effort and without wasting larger, more valuable logs. This labor was relentless, a race against the encroaching cold and the diminishing daylight hours. Upon arrival back at the homestead, the work continued. Freshly cut wood, full of sap, would not burn efficiently. It had to be seasoned, meaning left to dry for several months. Villagers would meticulously stack their firewood in neat, tightly packed piles, often against the outer walls of their homes or in dedicated woodsheds. These stacks were carefully constructed to allow air to circulate, aiding the drying process, and often covered with a simple thatch or a piece of hide to protect them from rain and snow. The goal was to have a sufficient supply of dry, ready-to-burn wood to last through the entire winter, a task that often required foresight and planning, stretching back to the previous spring. The sight of a well-stocked woodpile was a source of quiet satisfaction and a tangible sign of readiness. The management of this precious fuel was as important as its collection. Firewood was not a resource to be wasted. Every ember was cherished, every flame carefully tended. Fires were often built in the center of the home, in an open hearth, allowing the heat to radiate outwards and the smoke to escape through a hole in the roof. This central fire served multiple purposes. It provided warmth, a place to cook, and a focal point for family life during the long, dark evenings. Families would huddle around the hearth, sharing stories and performing small tasks by its flickering light. To conserve wood, fires were rarely allowed to blaze freely. Instead, they were carefully controlled, often banked overnight, by covering the embers with ash, ensuring that a glowing coal remained to restart the fire in the morning without the need for fresh kindling. This practice, known as banking the fire, was a simple but effective way to save wood and effort. Small pieces of wood were used first, with larger, slower-burning logs reserved for maintaining a steady heat. No scrap was too small to be used. Even the ashes were collected, sometimes for use in making soap or as fertilizer for the spring fields. In regions where wood was particularly scarce, villagers might turn to alternative fuels. In marshy or boggy areas, peat, a dense earthy material formed from decomposed vegetation, was dug and dried to be burned. While it produced a smoky, often acrid smell, peat provided a long-lasting heat. In some poorer or more treeless regions, even dried animal dung, particularly from cattle, might be collected and burned, though this was generally a last resort and often combined with other, more traditional fuels. The resourcefulness born of necessity pushed communities to find warmth wherever it could be found. The constant need for fuel also shaped communal life. Rules often governed who could collect wood, from where, and how much. Overharvesting could deplete a forest, threatening the long-term survival of the village. Therefore, sustainable practices, though not formally codified as they are today, were often implicitly understood and followed. Certain areas might be designated for collection in different years, allowing others to regenerate. This communal understanding was not written on parchment, but etched into the very fabric of their daily existence, passed down through generations, ensuring the forest's bounty for future winters. The collective effort of providing fuel for the entire community was a silent agreement, a recognition that individual survival depended on the health and resilience of the whole. The shared labor, the occasional helping hand offered to a neighbor struggling with a heavy load, all contributed to this quiet, unspoken bond. The deep satisfaction of a warm home, the inviting scent of wood smoke permeating the air, a constant reminder of safety and warmth in the face of the biting cold, and the knowledge that one had endured another day. These were the small triumphs that made the harshness of winter bearable, fueling not only the fire, but also the collective hope for the inevitable arrival of spring, when the cycle of life and labor would begin anew. While each household toiled tirelessly to secure its own survival, gathering and preserving every scrap of food and every piece of firewood, the medieval winter was never a solitary battle. Indeed, it was during these darkest, coldest months that the strength of the community, the very fabric of village life, was tested most severely and found to be absolutely indispensable. Survival depended not just on the isolated efforts of a single family, but deeply on the shared burdens, the mutual aid, and the collective resilience of the entire village. The cold winds that swept across the desolate land, the biting frost that seemed to penetrate even the thickest clothing and permeate thin, mud-daubed walls, the gnawing hunger that could set in when stores ran perilously low. These relentless compounding pressures forced villagers to rely on each other in profound, essential ways that we might find hard to fully grasp in our comfortable, modern world. There was no vast infrastructure of support, no distant aid arriving on demand. There was only the neighbor, the kin, the shared bond of the village, and the unwritten understanding that to survive, they must survive together. When the snow fell deep, blanketing the fields in a silent white expanse, and the winds howled like hungry wolves, often isolating hamlets for weeks or even months on end, the traditional lines between mine and ours frequently blurred. A family with a slightly better harvest, perhaps having managed to dry a few more sacks of peas or beans than their neighbors, or having been fortunate enough to preserve an extra side of precious salted pork, might quietly share with those who had less. This sharing was not merely an act of fleeting charity, quickly forgotten. It was a deeply ingrained, pragmatic investment in the collective well-being of the village. The understanding was clear and profound. A starving neighbor was a weak neighbor, one unable to contribute their vital labor to the demanding spring plowing or to join in the collective defense against bandits or common threats that might emerge from the desolate frozen landscape. This quiet exchange of sustenance built a web of reciprocal obligations, a living promise of aid that extended across the long, arduous winter nights, ensuring that no one truly faced destitution alone. Communal labor, already a cornerstone of medieval agricultural life, became even more critically important during these lean, unforgiving months. Imagine a heavy snowfall, perhaps several feet deep, blocking the narrow, winding path to the communal well, the sole consistent source of fresh water, or cutting off the limited access road to the nearest market town. A tenuous but vital connection for any rare necessity that might still be obtainable. It was not the task of one struggling man, burdened by his own family's needs, but rather the combined effort of several, often the strongest and youngest men, who would brave the numbing cold together. Their breath would mist in thick clouds in the frigid air as they worked, shoveling and clearing, their movements slow and deliberate in the deep, heavy drifts. Their hands, though chapped and raw from the cold and the constant labor, worked in a determined rhythm, driven by the unwavering shared understanding that access to the vital well or the cleared path was absolutely essential for the continued well-being of everyone in the village. Or consider the vital repairs needed for the village grist mill, the very heart of their food preparation, essential for grinding their precious hard-won grain into flour. Such repairs, often necessitated by damage from biting frost or unexpected winter floods, required the specialized knowledge of the village carpenter, perhaps even the skills of a local blacksmith, combined with the sheer brawn of several farmers. These were tasks that simply could not be undertaken by an individual family. They demanded the collective strength and specialized skills of the entire community working as one. The strategic sharing of limited resources extended beyond food and labor to the very warmth that kept life flickering. While the majority of daily cooking and heating occurred in individual homes, often with a simple open hearth at their center, some villages, particularly larger ones, maintained a communal oven, often situated near the church or the manor house. Here, families could bring their prepared dough to bake, utilizing a large, highly efficient oven heated by a common supply of wood. This practice saved their own limited, painstakingly gathered fuel for the essential task of keeping their small, often drafty homes barely habitable. These moments at the communal oven, the comforting, earthy smell of fresh bread, mingling with the pervasive scent of wood smoke, offered more than just practical efficiency. They provided rare opportunities for social interaction, a brief, precious respite from the relentless cold and the quiet isolation of their individual dwellings. It was a place for hushed conversations, shared anxieties, and perhaps a fleeting moment of warmth and human connection before returning to the biting air outside. Beyond practical assistance, there was the profound human need for connection and vital emotional support. The long, seemingly endless dark nights of winter could weigh heavily on the human spirit, fostering despair and loneliness, a sense of being utterly cut off from the world. Simple gatherings, perhaps around a roaring fire in a larger, slightly more comfortable home, or within the Lord's Hall if permission was granted, offered invaluable solace. Here, old stories were told and retold, their familiar narratives weaving comfort and continuity through the generations. Ancient songs, passed down through generations, were sung in low, comforting tones, their melodies filling the cold air and momentarily dispelling the gloom. The latest news, however scarce or trivial, was exchanged, each snippet a reminder of the wider world, however distant. These informal assemblies were not considered luxuries. They were understood to be absolutely vital for mental well-being, a crucial bulwark against the creeping despair that prolonged cold, hunger, and isolation could bring. Laughter, however rare, was recognized as a form of warmth itself, a fleeting but powerful antidote to the harsh realities pressing in from all sides. The village also functioned as an essential safety net for its most vulnerable members. If a parent fell gravely ill, succumbing to the coughs and fevers that were rampant in the winter months, or if a child was tragically orphaned by disease or accident, the community would instinctively step in. Neighbors, despite their own struggles and limited means, would bring what little food they could spare, perhaps a small portion of dried meat or a handful of stored root vegetables. They would assist with daily chores that the sick or grieving could no longer manage, fetching water from the icy well, tending to precious animals, or mending tattered clothes. In extreme cases, they would even take the orphaned children into their own, already crowded and humble homes, sharing their meager resources and offering a fragile but profound sense of security. This was more than simple kindness. It was a deep moral imperative, rooted in a profound sense of shared destiny and often reinforced by the strong Christian teachings of the era. To turn away a suffering villager, to allow a family to perish from neglect or lack of aid, was not just an act of cruelty, it was understood as an act that weakened the entire delicate fabric of survival for everyone, the old whose strength had faded, the infirm whose bodies were ravaged by illness, the very young utterly dependent and helpless. They were protected not just out of an abstract sense of compassion, but because their continued well-being, however seemingly small, contributed directly to the overall health and resilience of the community as a whole. Every life lost was a loss to the collective strength of the village. This intricate, often unspoken system of mutual aid was not without its inevitable tensions. Disputes over dwindling resources, disagreements over land use, or long-simmering resentments over perceived slights could and did fester, especially when nerves were frayed by the relentless cold and pervasive hunger. But the overwhelming, undeniable necessity of sheer survival often overshadowed such quarrels. When the snow piled high against the doors and the food stores dwindled to alarming levels, cooperation was not merely an option or a noble ideal. It was the single, unavoidable path forward. Every pair of willing hands, every bit of shared knowledge about foraging or healing, every spare scrap of food or carefully hoarded piece of fuel contributed directly to the delicate, precarious balance that kept the village alive until the first tentative green shoots of spring promised the longed-for relief. It was a profound testament to human resilience, not just as isolated individuals struggling against immense odds, but as a collective, bound tightly by the harsh, unyielding realities of their world, facing the winter not as separate units, but as one enduring, interdependent body. As the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, another silent, ever-present threat emerged within the medieval village: illness. The harsh conditions of winter, combined with a diet that became increasingly monotonous and deficient, created a fertile ground for disease. You might have felt the creeping chill in your very bones, a profound, penetrating dampness that seemed to seep into every fiber of your being, weakening your inherent resistance and making even the simplest movements feel heavy. The air inside homes, though often a welcome respite from the biting winds outside, was frequently thick and stagnant, heavy with the smoke from the central hearth and the close breath of many bodies huddled together for warmth. This necessary close proximity, while offering vital heat and comfort, also meant that any simple cough or an innocent sneeze could quickly and almost inevitably spread its contagion through the entire household, and then, with alarming speed, ripple through the close-knit community of the village. Common ailments like persistent colds and hacking coughs were, of course, ubiquitous, becoming a pervasive part of daily life during the colder months. These minor complaints often developed into far more serious respiratory infections, such as debilitating bronchitis or life-threatening pneumonia, especially among the most vulnerable members of the community, the very young, whose immune systems were still developing, and the elderly, whose fragile bodies struggled relentlessly against the ceaseless cold and the demands of their environment. But beyond these familiar and often unavoidable winter maladies, more insidious and truly terrifying threats lurked. The severe scarcity of fresh fruits and green vegetables, particularly after the carefully stored autumn supplies began to dwindle and rot in the deepest, most unforgiving part of winter, frequently led to widespread and debilitating nutritional deficiencies. One such dreaded and often fatal condition was scurvy, caused by a severe and prolonged lack of vitamin C. Its grim symptoms, including painfully bleeding gums, loosening teeth, extreme and crushing fatigue that made even rising from bed an ordeal, and agonizing joint pain that could render a person immobile, would slowly and agonizingly debilitate an individual, making them profoundly more susceptible to other opportunistic infections and, in severe untreated cases, leading inevitably to a slow, painful death. You would have witnessed friends or family members grow progressively weaker, their faces pale and drawn, their spirits flagging with each passing day, and understood the silent, gnawing fear that accompanied such unexplained and often untreatable sickness. The constant presence of this fear was a heavy burden, a stark reminder of life's fragility. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was, by modern standards, rudimentary at best, a complex tapestry woven from a blend of ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, passed down through scribes and scholars, centuries of practical folk wisdom, and a deep, intuitive reliance on natural remedies drawn directly from the land. There were no trained doctors in the contemporary sense available in most rural villages. Instead, when illness struck, people instinctively turned to the local wise woman, often an revered elder in the community who possessed a lifetime of learned experience, or a dedicated village healer, someone who had inherited generations of accumulated knowledge about the specific properties of various herbs, the preparation of effective poultices, and the application of simple, time-honored treatments. Their theoretical understanding of the intricate workings of the human body was admittedly limited by the science of their age, but their practical, hands-on experience with common ailments and the subtle nuances of local flora was invaluable and often life-saving. When sickness struck, the very first and often most crucial line of defense was invariably rest and warmth. You, or the afflicted individual, would be tenderly wrapped in layer upon layer of woolen blankets, perhaps given a warm, nourishing broth carefully made from dried meat or carefully rationed root vegetables, and gently but firmly encouraged to sleep as much as possible, allowing the body to dedicate its energy to healing. For the relief of pain and the reduction of fever, the healer might meticulously prepare and offer a bitter-tasting infusion made from the bark of a willow tree, which, entirely unbeknownst to them or their patients, contained salicin, a natural compound chemically similar to the active ingredient in modern aspirin. For unsettling digestive complaints, a soothing chamomile tea might be prescribed, widely known for its calming and restorative properties. Garlic, with its distinctive pungent scent and its deeply ingrained perception of possessing powerful medicinal qualities, was frequently employed, sometimes crushed into a thick paste and carefully applied as a poultice to wounds or infected areas, or simply eaten raw to ward off infections and strengthen the body. Other common and widely trusted herbs included fragrant thyme for persistent coughs, refreshing mint for stomach aches and nausea, and a diverse array of wild berries and roots, meticulously gathered and dried during the sunnier, warmer months, each meticulously believed to possess specific and often miraculous healing powers for a variety of conditions. These simple, yet often remarkably effective remedies provided crucial comfort and frequently aided the body's own powerful natural healing processes for minor ailments. However, for severe and life-threatening infections, for complicated broken bones that often led to debilitating deformities, or when devastating epidemics like the dreaded plague or virulent smallpox or dysentery swept through a region, the available options were starkly, tragically limited. There were, of course, no antibiotics to combat bacterial infections, no complex surgical procedures to correct internal injuries, and virtually no understanding of germ theory, which would only emerge centuries later. Hygiene, by modern standards, was often poor, contributing significantly and tragically to the rapid and widespread dissemination of disease. While people did wash themselves and their clothing and often intuitively understood the importance of clean water for drinking, the concept of microscopic pathogens invisible to the naked eye was still centuries away from being discovered and understood. Consequently, many diseases that are now easily treatable today, such as a burst appendix or a severe bacterial infection, were in the medieval period often a swift and agonizing death sentence. When truly catastrophic diseases like the infamous Black Death or other devastating epidemics such as smallpox, measles, or dysentery swept relentlessly through a region, the villagers were largely helpless, caught in the grip of forces they could neither comprehend nor control. They could attempt to isolate the sick, offer fervent prayers, and desperately rely on the sheer resilience and deep-seated solidarity of the community. But the mortality rates were often horrifyingly high, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable sorrow and loss. You would have witnessed the quiet, pervasive grief that settled over the village, the heartbreaking sight of empty chairs by the central hearth where loved ones once sat, the raw fear etched onto the gaunt faces of those who miraculously remained. In such profoundly desperate times, faith played an even more central and profound role in daily life. Constant prayers for divine healing were offered with fervent hope, and people often sought direct divine intervention through the intercession of saints or by undertaking arduous pilgrimages, believing that sickness was sometimes a divine punishment for sins or a challenging trial sent from God to test their faith. Yet, despite these truly formidable and often overwhelming challenges, there was a quiet, almost stubborn resilience that characterized the medieval spirit. The village healers, with their limited tools and profound knowledge of the local environment, worked tirelessly, often putting their own health at risk. Families nursed their sick with unwavering devotion, sharing what little warmth, comfort, and precious food they had, demonstrating an unbreakable bond of kinship. The inexorable cycle of life and death was a harsh and ever-present reality, but it was met not with despair, but with an enduring spirit of survival, a collective determination to simply survive until the sun once again brought its life-giving warmth and renewed the promise of spring to the weary land. The constant, arduous fight against winter's relentless chill extended not only to the immediate physical world of procuring food and maintaining shelter, but also, and perhaps most crucially, to the vital health and overall well-being of every single individual within the community, a constant, silent, and often desperate battle fought within the humble yet fiercely protected confines of each home. The deep winter months, stretching from the solemn quiet of November through the bitter grip of February and into the deceptive warmth of March, were a test of pure, unyielding endurance. You lived not just day by day, but hour by hour, your entire world shrinking to the confines of your